Alexandra, in case you can hear me, yeah, you can start recording. All right. Well, I think what I'm going to do now is, yeah, it's recording. That's great. I think we might as well start. So let's see if I need to admit anyone else in. No, not yet. Okay, good. Okay, so welcome everybody to this new event at the British Cultural Studies MA program in Bucharest, where we are happy to entertain a distinguished guest, one of our alumni, Monica Popescu, who is now an established scholar and a William Dawson Scholar of African Literature and an associate professor at McGill University. And among her other professional feats, she is the book series co-editor for Routledge, Studies in Cultures of the Global Cold War, which will be our theme today, at least part of it, right, Monica? And she authored important books, like, for instance, at Penpoint, African Literatures, Postcolonial Studies, and the Cold War, which came out at Duke in 2020, and got an honorable mention for the Scaglione Prize in Comparative Literary Studies from Modern Language Association. And also she co-edited with, is it Karen or Bystrom?
Yes.
Or Karen Bystrom, right?
Carrie
Bystrom, okay. And who's the other? The other co-editor is
Katie Zien.
Katie Zien. Okay. A book that sounds great: The Cultural Cold War and the Global South: Sites of Contest and Communitas, at Routledge, 2021. But an older book was by Monica Popescu, was South African Literature Beyond the Cold War, came out at Palgrave in 2010. So, and obviously there's a number of other studies that she published and articles in periodicals. But I think that is enough to give you the magnitude of her professional endeavors and how well received they are. And I think we can all be very proud that indeed she comes from the Bucharest School of Anglophone Studies, let's call it. And she has a degree, she has a BA degree and an MA degree from Bucharest University, and then went on to do a PhD at UPenn, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, good. So we're very happy to have you here with us today, and it was gracious of you to respond to our invitation. And now I think we are keen to listen to you, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and we'll ask a few questions about your topic, but also about other work that you've produced, and perhaps the relevance of your background and your experience here at Bucharest to your work. So, Monica, please go ahead. We're dying to listen to you.
Thank you very much. Professor Mihaela, you said something.
I wanted to add something to what is. Does it work now?
Yes, it works.
Yes,
okay.
We can hear you.
Monica, you forgot to say that you are also a PhD student at the University of Bucharest.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. But then,
under your supervision, Professor Mihaela.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you changed not only the place, but also the topic, no?
Yes.
The projects a little
Yeah.
bit. Okay.
Yeah. I'm so grateful to be here and also to have so many distinguished people in the audience, people who have influenced my trajectory in life. So when I chatted with Professor Stefanescu about this, and now I'm seeing Sabina as well. Thank you for coming, Sabina. We agreed that I would give an overview of my research interests. And I actually want to start with kind of like at the beginning with how I got to my research interest in the Cold War and African literature, because it all started in Bucharest. And you know, if I am to pinpoint one particular moment where, you know, I started to turn towards postcolonial studies, on the one hand, it was the MA program, which was in literatures in English, so Anglophone literatures. And, you know, we had courses in Australian literature and in Canadian literature. So for the first time, you know, I was exposed to literatures outside of Britain and the United States, and so for me that was quite really interesting. But during the BA program, in a class with Professor Stefanescu, a class on rhetoric, we read a text by Françoise Thom on La Langue de Bois. And for me, that was a moment that was like a light bulb that, oh, it's possible to actually write and to research topics that are really close to our heart, to what we are experiencing. And for me, this is what became an abiding interest, starting with my second MA degree, which I got in Canada at the University of Windsor. I was starting to ask questions about how we can think about the Romanian experience during the communist regime through a perspective that brings the tools of postcolonial studies, so the study of imperialism, the forms of not just economic domination, political domination, but also cultural domination to bear on the situation in Romania and other Eastern European countries. And the study of Eastern Europe and post-communist studies were just developing at that time in the late 1990s, and so it was quite an effervescent field. And for me, post-colonial studies afforded this perspective that otherwise we might not have had on what had happened to us in Romania. So that's pretty much how I started asking questions about what are connections between post-colonial and post-communist cultures. And then during my PhD studies at the University of Pennsylvania, I took a class on South African literature, and that was the aha moment, because there are so many similarities. Sorry, I'm losing my I'm losing my voice. So many similarities between what was happening in South Africa in the 1990s and what was happening in Romania and other Eastern European countries in terms of the effervescence of coming out of an oppressive regime, but an oppressive regime that was actually also very different in ideological terms, because South Africa during apartheid presented itself as being a bastion of Western culture, but without supporting capitalism. So it was a really interesting mix of supporting a kind of like state-owned economy, but with very pro-Western views, and coming out of a totalitarian or very oppressive regime as well. so I started to see parallels between those two contexts, and that's what I wrote my PhD on. And then the first book that I wrote after that, which Professor Stefanescu mentioned, South African Literature Beyond the Cold War, was actually focused on this moment of the 1990s, and but just from a South African perspective, I wanted to ask, what was the role of Eastern Europe in the South African cultural imaginary? So how would South African writers imagine Eastern Europe? And for some of them, Eastern Europe was a repository of revolutionary ideas, especially, going back to the October Revolution and also the transformations to socialist countries. So they were seeing that of course, in a positive light, because in South Africa, the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress were at the helm of the country after the end of apartheid, and they had been supported by the Soviet Union and by other Eastern European countries. So they saw that in a really important, positive light for them. Then there were the writers who were also attuned to the experience of dissidents in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Bloc, what it meant to be persecuted by the state, to write samizdat, or to have to go abroad and to write from that perspective, as so many South African writers who were opposing apartheid had to do. So those connections with the dissident writers were that was another way in which Eastern Europe featured in the South African imaginary. And then, of course, there were the right-wingers who and the supporters of apartheid, who saw Eastern Europe as this very dangerous area who could contaminate South Africa, or worse, participate in some kind of Soviet invasion of South Africa. So there is all this kind of imaginary that South Africans had about Eastern Europe. But what was underneath this all was actually something that I didn't get to explore a lot in this book, but I was very much interested in exploring, namely the Cold War, right? That everything was based on the foundation of the Cold War. So in my most recent book at Penpoint, African Literature's Postcolonial Studies and the Cold War, that's pretty much what I went on to explore, but at the larger scale of the African continent. I was interested in how African literature as a field emerged from the crucible of the Cold War, how the cultural battles between the supporters of the West and of the Eastern Bloc had shaped the rise of African literature in the 1950s and 1960s, and the flourishing through the 70s and the 80s. And I'm saying this not in the sense that African writers were subservient to one ideological position or another, that they were just being influenced from the West or from the Eastern Bloc, but they were participants in some of the most important cultural debates that were taking place at that time. And indeed, we can read African literature as a way to access the hottest debates that were taking place, for instance, in the 1960s. And those are some of my concerns when I was looking at cultural materials produced in the 60s and 70s and so on, how were the writers imagining themselves? Like, what did they see their function in society? And at the time, there were two predominant models. On the one hand, there was the autonomy model, which was grounded on a kind of like modernist vision, and it had of course Western origins, and in which the writers were supposed to be naysayers to the authorities, to the powers that be, to exist autonomously from the state, from political institutions, and that's why also writers who were dissidents were lionized in the West. Think about, you know, the PEN prizes for dissident writers, and supporting those who were being persecuted by the state, especially when the state was a socialist state. So this is one model, and on the other hand, there's the model of the committed writer, and there are two kind of like origins of this idea of the committed writer. On the one hand, we can go back to the West and Jean-Paul Sartre, and on the other hand, of course, there's the Soviet Union and the 1930s, Maxim Gorky, and the transformation of the thinking of what the writer was supposed to do, and the writer was being seen as a kind of like citizen worker who was participating in the transformation of society, and some African writers were siding with one perspective, and others with the other. So some were supporters of the autonomous position of the writer, and others as the citizen fighter. Actually, there was a conference in the early 60s that took place in Sweden, and at that conference, South African writer Alex Laguma stood up and said that it was basically based on a misunderstanding of the discussion. There were writers were speaking in French and writers were speaking in English, but this writer thought that there was a misunderstanding about what the function of the writers was, and he stood up and he said, "I, as a South African writer, am ready to defend, you know, South Africa with weapons if need be," right? So what is the relationship between wearing guns and using pens, right? So hence, you know, that's where the title of my book also came from, and influenced by Ngugi wa Thiong'o as well. This idea of writing at Penpoint, right? That kind of transformation of writing into an implement of the struggle. So when we think about traditional ways of studying African literature, up to quite recently, African literature was being seen as having been influenced radically in positive and negative ways by the experience of colonization. So decolonization was the main prism, lens through which we would see African literature. But to me, that was an incomplete way of assessing African literature, especially, you know, after the Second World War, because of the cultural influences of the Cold War. So that led me to this intersection, and the interest in how the Cold War shaped the discussions in the formation of African literary institutions, in shaping the tenets of the conversations in the most important journals and magazines on the continent, in what they were talking at conferences. And there's a little historian there inside me who loves going to archives, and I've done a lot of archival research, and it's really important to, I think, to not project back our own interests onto what was happening in the 1950s and 1960s, and to actually go to look at the documents and see what they were interested in talking at those times, because the way in which writers at the time were conceptualizing what African literature was supposed to do and to be about was actually different from what we imagine it today. And also, it was not a foregone conclusion. In the same way in which historian Jeffrey Burns says that the forms of statehood that African states would take after independence was not a foregone conclusion, in the sense that they could choose a democratic model, like a Western model, but of course there's also the Eastern Bloc. There was the Soviet Union offering a model of statehood, so they could choose that. There were plus other options in terms of unions, regional unions, or Pan-African unions. So in the same way, cultural production and the forms that it would take was not a foregone conclusion of what African literature could look like at that time. So yeah, basically the past decade, I've been kind of like digging into archives and researching these conversations, and some of the archival finds were really staggering, because I did not expect that both Western countries, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, would be so invested in African literature, and not just African literature, literature around the globe. Especially, if we think from our contemporary perspective, in which the humanities are defunded, and there isn't really interest. You can't get politicians to be excited about literature. It's quite stunning to see how interested, for instance, the CIA was in literary production, because they saw literature as a tool for soft power, right? Of ways of influencing hearts and minds across the world, to making not just intellectuals and writers, but the respective societies at large become more accepting of American ways and American interests. And the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. And so the CIA, for instance, had this humongous operation across the globe, not just in Africa, that most of it was under the umbrella of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was funded in the 1950s in Europe, and was based in Paris. And they provided money for magazines and also for conferences across the globe, but especially in what we call now the global South, or what was called then the Third World, and with no kind of like overt attempts to influence the outcomes of cultural debates, but just of kind of like gently swaying cultural production. So it's really interesting to see how the superpowers were so invested in what writers would have to say. For me, one of the most stunning discoveries was a NATO document, a report on the 1958 conference of Afro-Asian writers that took place in Tashkent. Like, why would NATO be interested in, you know, what African and Asian writers would say to each other at a conference in Tashkent, right? It's like it almost boggled the mind, the imagination that it could be to that level of detail. But for them, it was like really important what those writers were saying to each other, to what extent the Soviet Union was trying to attract them, by what means, you know, by the publication of books, by translations, right? The translations as an important way of swaying the interest of these writers. So yeah, this is this was the kind of like the basis on which my recent research has developed, and the recent book. But at the same time, I was also interested in what African literature could tell us about the larger disciplines. So on the one hand, I was saying that we need to look at the conjunction between Cold War studies and post-colonial studies, and how they can give us a new perspective on African literature, because they had not been seen together up to, quite recently. But on the other hand, it's also important to think how African literature can reflect back on what it was missing in Cold War studies and in post-colonial studies. Because on the one hand, Cold War studies was founded as an American discipline with American interest at heart, and seeing the world in a Manichaean way, as polarized between the US and the USSR. And for Cold War studies, the third world, what we call the global South today, was just, they were just pawns. The various countries were just pawns in a game of chess between the superpowers. But the Cold War was experienced as cold only in the North, right? In the global North, only in the first and the second world. It's the third world countries that experienced it as a hot conflict, whether, you know, it was Vietnam, or it was the Horn of Africa, or it was Angola, or, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So those were the hotspots of the world. And I was interested in how African literature, for instance, reflected the Cold War as a hot conflict. That was another thing that I was quite invested in. And also the ways in which writers from the global South contributed to changing the conversation topics. And inserting their own interests and perspectives in order to understand this global conflict. So that's how I think that Cold War studies needed to be modified, and that's also part of, you know, my editorial project with Routledge, with this book series that we are hoping, you know, to publish new perspectives on the Cold War, the cultural Cold War, that bring in that global South point of view. And then, you know, on the other hand, there was the need for a much more nuanced understanding of what post-colonial studies was about, because the way in which post-colonial studies was institutionalized in the in the 1990s, that, you know, when the big anthologies were produced, the big kind of like surveys of the field were produced, was that postcolonial studies had mostly cultural focus, that inherited its intellectual tools from post-structuralism, and that was very much in a kind of depoliticized fashion that this was being done, which to me, you know, is another kind of like research interest that I'm pursuing now, that the kind of rise of postcolonial studies out of the Cold War, and because of the kind of cultural restrictions and impositions of what good studies were supposed to be in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And what was being lost in postcolonial studies were earlier works by anti-colonial intellectuals who were Marxists, because they were being seen as being too overtly political, that they were being seen as being too reductive. And if you look, for instance, you know, at works like by Ashcroft, Diffin, and Griffith, kind of like the most some of the most important voices in the founding of the field. You already see that bias against Marxist post-colonial or anti-colonial writing in their works. So by putting the Cold War together with post-colonial studies, it actually allows for all that writing that had been done by anti-colonial Marxist intellectuals like Aimé Césaire or Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Amilcar Cabral, to come to the foreground, right, and to be recognized as having established really important topics of conversation, but which was kind of written out of what post-colonial studies was supposed to be in the 1990s. So yeah, I've been talking nonstop for the past half hour or so. So maybe I should you know, stop here and let you ask questions if you have questions, and then I can you know, add a few more things.
Well, quite frankly, I didn't notice how time fled this half hour. You know, it went like minutes. It was very fascinating, at least for me. But I'm sure the other people in the audience are just as interested in the topic and in what you have to say about it. Because obviously, what you have to be aware of is that among other classes taught here, we are opening the field of cultural studies and post-colonial cultural studies to this parallel with Eastern Europe, with post-communism, the post-Soviet world. I think it's already 12 years, I think, since I started teaching this class in post-communism, post-colonialism. There have been important contributions from Romanian scholars to this. Including Rodica Mihaela here, you know, who wrote an article in, was it Euresis, if I'm not mistaken, where you discuss this reluctance, which is one of the questions that I have for you. How do you deal with the reluctance in these quarters of post-colonial studies to acknowledge the links, to acknowledge the similarity of the colonial and post-colonial condition? Because that's going to probably affect you as well, and has affected you as well. The fact that people are not accustomed to discussing these terms. But anyway, given this background, obviously, we're very interested and we were happy to hear you talk about these things. So now I open the floor to questions and comments, brief comments if possible, to allow people to participate. So anybody, please feel free. I have a lot of questions, but anyway. I'll leave that to the end.
I'd like to ask you a question, Monica.
Yeah.
So, yeah, given the present situation in the conflict, Ukraine, Russia, I would say that the second Cold War is knocking at the door. So my question, also given the rising influence of Russia and China in Africa in general, and lately, would you say that a second Cold War would be as influential in African literatures as the first one was?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much, and I'll also try to link it to what Professor Stefanescu said earlier, right? That for us in Eastern Europe, it has been so important, to make this connection about the forms of imperialism that we have experienced from Russia, from the Soviet Union, but also going further back in time to the other empires in the era, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman Empire, the Prussian, and the kind of like single-minded focus that post-colonial scholars in the West have had on what we might call the classical forms of colonialism, that is, British and French and Portuguese and so on. So that's why I think that it's so important. And as Professor Stefanescu said, that Romanian scholars and also other Eastern European scholars have contributed so much to unearthing the intersecting forms of colonialism and imperialism, cultural imperialism, but also political forms of imperialism in the region, and also to see that, for instance, current day Russia is, inheriting a legacy of imperialism from the Soviet Union, which of course itself had inherited forms of imperialism from the previous Russian empire. And yes, definitely, I think we are heading into, or we are already within another Cold War kind of conflict. Let's hope that it stays cold, right? I mean that's the big concern, and I'm sure that the Ukrainians will say that it's very hot. I've actually written recently on how the past alliances that were formed during the Cold War were reshaped by the conflict in Ukraine, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union supported liberation movements that were especially Marxist leftist in orientation on the African continent and elsewhere in the world. But with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was Russia that pretty much assumed the legacy of those of all that support. And the contributions, for instance, of a country like Ukraine were erased from that that picture, so that today it's shocking to see African intellectuals, like Indian intellectuals, saying things like, like Russia has not colonized us. Russia is not a colonial power. It's like, how can you possibly say that? Like, look at them, they've invaded an independent nation and they are trying to colonize it. So this kind of dissociation between seeing the role of Russia today and also of the Soviet Union as an imperial power, because the Soviet Union in the past had supported decolonization movements, right? So I think that this is what us as scholars need to focus on, that this very complicated cultural landscape in which alliances have shifted and former alliances have frayed as a result of the war in Ukraine. But also the new kind of blind spots that are emerging, the fact that, you know, African writers or African, I wrote on a Ghanaian Romanian artist, One Love the Kubolor. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's really a wonderful artist and activist. Artivist, as he calls himself, but at the same time, right, someone who could say things like Putin is not a colonizer. So how do we square those two things, that the kind of nuanced attention to forms of colonization around the world and sympathy towards the plight of other people who are enduring new forms of imperialism, inability to see, you know, what is happening in Ukraine, also because of the way in which students in Ukraine have been treated by Ukrainian authorities at the border, right? And, or, you know, like in Poland. And I haven't read any bad stories about Romania yet, but I'm sure that, you know, they can be very far from the surface, right? In terms of discrimination that people of color have had in this experience of displacement and being refugees.
Right, and definitely we. I remember just very recently reading an article by the Yale historian Timothy Snyder, who was talking about Russia wielding a colonial war.
Yeah,
basically, he was arguing
it's basically
that this is
colonial.
definitely a colonial war, with
Yes,
historical arguments going back to the formation of Ukrainian the state
Nation,
and the nation and so on and so forth. So, you know, 13th century.
exactly.
Yeah. So it's a long history of colonialism, of waves of colonialism. Yeah, and
Yes.
different colonial centers interfering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
I think that it's absolutely clear that this experience of what we are experiencing today will have a very strong impact on post-colonial theory.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ioana, I think you were trying to say something. Yes.
Yes. From the very beginning of your very beautiful, enlightening, and actually very natural talk as well, Monica, was wondering about the decade of the 1950s and 1960s in South Africa, and you mentioned the conversation around this decade, and I wonder to what extent, they were aware of the Stalinist dictatorship that was in place in this decade, and of course, probably, or not of course, probably they were simply not aware of it or didn't want to take it into account. So to answer the final question of the conversation, which has just ended, why people are not aware of this and that negative aspect of, I don't know, a doctrine, an ideology that they embrace. It's a matter of embracing half-truths like half-lies. They are never conducing to a good thing. And it's in the nature of, I don't know, human society and ordinary people to work with half-truths and half-lies. And this is why we get bungled up, or things get bungled up, and we get so, because we do not, okay, so what is the way out of this? According to John Stuart Mill, in one talk in the 19th century, people were always right in upholding democracy. Under the title of civic education at the time. He was talking about the ways in which people were always right in the history of doctrines in what they affirmed, and always wrong in what they denied. So people should look at the affirmative aspects, but not blindly. And I don't know, so far as it is possible, not work with, not embrace, not hurry to embrace, I don't know what other doctrine without knowing the details, the context of that other doctrine. Because of course, it all comes out of the Soviets denouncing colonialism, Western colonialism, but of course, practicing what they did in their own home, they were in the wrong in what they practiced but they were in the right, on the other hand, in what was. So I don't know what to say. I can't draw a conclusion. What is your reaction to this?
Yeah, thank you. That's such an enlightening comment and question. Timothy Brennan says that the kind of entrenched ideological positions during the Cold War, like supporting Western style of democracy or supporting Eastern Bloc socialism, that one could get from one to the other only by some kind of religious conversion, religious type of conversion, right? That people were so kind of like entrenched in those positions, and I think that kind of explains the blind spots, the willful almost blind spots that people had during that time, that they could not embrace the nuanced perspective that both sides had done both good and a tremendous amount of harm and violence, and had inflicted a tremendous amount of violence. I mean, it's so much easier in some ways for us with hindsight, to say, but how could they, be so blinded? And you mentioned, that in South Africa in the 1950s and 1960s being blinded to what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time, and to some extent that they were willfully blinded to that. So until after Stalin's death, they would not accept Marxist parties throughout the world, not just in South Africa, right? Would not accept that the Soviet Union could be in the wrong, or that there are any abuses there, and those who were dissenters were pretty much expelled from the ranks or purged, or right. And in South Africa, a good example for this is a formidable couple in South African culture and politics, that is the Joe Slovo Ruth First couple. Joe Slovo was the head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party, and his wife Ruth First was really a superb intellectual and a very gifted writer, who was Marxist, leftist, a staunch leftist, but at the same time not blinded to what the Soviet Union represented. And for instance, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in '68, their opinions pretty much split in terms of Slovo was, the Soviet Union is right because they are supporting us, so they have to be right. And Ruth First was like, no, they've invaded a country, a peaceful country that wanted to forge its own way forward. And as a result, she was marginalized in the ANC and the SACP. And only recently, like in the past decade, her contributions have started to be recognized in South Africa. It's just some 10 years ago that they finally named a highway, for instance, after her. It's stunning, right? That someone who has written so many books, has done so much. She was actually killed by the South African security forces with a parcel bomb. She was in Mozambique, where she had set up a cultural institute and doing all this amazing work, and she was assassinated. So yeah, that's how far, you know, the split in perspectives went.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, good. Any questions from the students? I mean, I would like to hear the young generation as well, not just the still young generation that has been engaged in the discussion so far. Sabina, just a second. Let's wait for the students, and then I'll give you, and I'll ask questions myself. Paul, go ahead, please. Paul Postin, one of our students here at the MA program.
So I found the connections fascinating. I would have never thought that we can connect African literature with post-communism, post-colonialism, and the Cold War. And I was curious if you also studied the South African perspective with regard to the Eastern European space before the Cold War. I mean, is there such a perspective possible, or did the Cold War kind of facilitate the creation of this South African Eastern European landscape that we are now able to talk about? And if both things happen, if there is this perception of in South African literature with regard to Eastern Europe before the Cold War, how would you define the ideological shift after the Cold War? How are these two different? I know nothing about African literature, so, but I think it's really interesting.
Thank you so much for your question. That's a great question. So I think that there were kind of like moments of encounters between South African culture and cultural imaginary and political imaginary and Eastern Europe. For instance, when the Russians defeated the British in the Crimean War in the 19th century, the Black South Africans heard about that, and they thought that the Russians must be Black, right? Because they were fighting the British. They were fighting the common enemy. They had defeated the common enemy, so they must be Black, right? And that also led, for instance, to people being named with Russia-related names in, for instance, Zulu culture, which is stunning, right? This idea of the Black Russians fighting the common enemy. Also, you know, like the kind of connections are sometimes not quite felicitous. For instance, there was a strike in the 1930s in South Africa, and white workers were striking for more jobs that would be actually taken away from Black employees, and they came out with the slogan, you know, borrowed from the International and borrowed from the Soviet Union, early Soviet Union tradition: workers of the world unite for a white South Africa, right? So that's kind of like absolutely staggering that something like that could happen, right? So there's also misappropriation of what could be the goal of an ideological approach, of an alliance, of a movement, for purposes that are really staggering, such as, you know, these white workers trying to get the upper hand over Black workers in South Africa. And sorry, I forgot what was the second part of the question. I think that there was a connection with the present.
Yeah, I was asking, how would you define the ideological shift before the Cold War, the perception, and how the perception with regard to Eastern Europe changed after the Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, after the Cold War, there's a writer that I really love. His name is Ivan Vladislavic. His ancestry is partially Croatian, hence the name. He has some of the most interesting South African writing on what the Eastern Europe represents for South Africans. And in the 1990s, that meant, you know, immigrants was funny names, you know, who would end up in South Africa. And let's not forget that especially in the early 1990s, South Africa was accepting anyone who would come there, that the white government will, so that they would increase the numbers of the white population in South Africa, and the result was also that there were like extreme right-wingers who came. One of the most important figures in the anti-apartheid movement, Chris Hani, was assassinated by a Polish immigrant to South Africa. So, you know, there's a short story by Vladislavic that I really recommend and I love a lot. It's called Propaganda by Monuments. And it focuses on the correspondence between tavern owner black tavern owner in South Africa in the 1990s, and someone in a ministry in Russia, somewhere in Russia, and the tavern owner wants to acquire a head of Lenin that is being, you know, one of the statues that is being dismantled in the former Soviet Union. So there's this correspondence about you know, what would happen and how to get the statue of Lenin to South Africa. It ends up with the owner realizing that it would pretty much dwarf his establishment, that it would be impossible to bring it to South Africa, and that he would have to, you know, donate it to the community because it would not serve the purposes of the, you know, the VI Lenin Bar and Grill in South Africa. So that's, you know, that was the perspective in the 1990s. In the new millennium, I think things are much more varied, because the kind of renewed interest that Russia, for instance, has in Africa, not just in South Africa, because of the ways in which a lot of the ANC authorities still feel very tied to Russia. Also seen in the hesitation that they've had in denouncing Putin, for instance, for his war in Ukraine. So now it depends based on which country we are talking about.
Right. Then perhaps we should go to Sabina. I just realized if we're gonna disseminate this via the internet, to kind of upload this on our site or something like that, I should be making it clear that I'm not, emphatically, I'm not Sorana Corneanu. The only reason I have that tag name is because Sorana initiated this Zoom meeting, but unfortunately she couldn't make it for, you know, she has some family problems, nothing serious.
But there is another you. I can see another you.
Yes, and I connected as myself. I connected as
muted.
myself too, via the smartphone. But just to make sure people don't take me for another exceptional academic like Monica Sorana Corneanu, who's unfortunately not here. But Sabina, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Monica, for a wonderful talk. It's always very rewarding to listen to you. This is very puzzling. All this story that you've been picturing. I mean, all your research, in fact, has a few points that are very puzzling to me because I'm actually fascinated by all these overlaps, which I think are actually very are the most interesting part of them all. So on the one hand, we know that we've been struggling with, I mean, in Eastern Europe, we've been struggling for decades now to define this discipline of post-communism that Bogdan knows a lot about, and he's been teaching this dialogue between post-communism and post-colonialism. And there are, of course, some common points, but one stumbling block has always been the definition of colonialism itself. So what is colonialism after all? Is it the white man's burden as Kipling was defining it, or as we define it in the wake of Kipling? Is it something that is biased racially par excellence and there's no way out of this? And does colonialism in that sense still exist? Because by the end of the second millennium, we were talking about the transformation of post-colonialism into maybe transnational studies, globalization, all this. Well, the rise of global writing in English, which I'm very interested in, and then in the more recent years, it seems that all this discussion about colonialism and post-colonialism is coming back, and the terms are being reassessed because all sorts of new situations, all sorts of neo-colonialisms are appearing, and one of them could be what's going on in Ukraine now. So I'm wondering how you position your terms with respect to this, and to what extent has your research on South Africa been enlightening to you theoretically? Because I remember an older article of yours around Lenin's statue, where you were discussing precisely. So there was a statue of Lenin that had been displaced from wherever it was, and then there was a whole theoretical debate that you were building around it with respect to the extent to which we can juggle with these overlaps between post-colonialism and post-communism. So that was in the 90s, if I remember correctly. But then how do you reposition this dialogue between these two huge theoretical concepts, post-colonialism and post-communism now? And my other, I mean, this is my theoretical question, let's put it that way. I've got a very applied literary mind on the other hand, and I'm very tempted to say that I would love it if you could give more literary examples from what's going on in Africa with respect to this response to the Cold War. So you've mentioned Vladislavic, but could you point to other authors that you've been working with and that reflect on this really interesting response to the Cold War in Africa generally, but more specifically in South Africa, which itself is a very interesting case. I mean, the situation of the white workers of the world that are supposed to unite is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, this is totally wrong from a communist perspective, right? But then, has communism ever been right? The history of communism is a long history of failures to be what it predicated itself as being. So yeah, what do you think?
Thanks so much, Sabina. It's always so nice to have conversations with you. So thanks for these questions. Yes, so in my recent book, I definitely define imperialism and colonialism as the overlap between synchronous and also the persistence of diachronic the forms of imperialism, overlapping forms of imperialism, that we cannot possibly define imperialism and colonialism without thinking of the various forms of domination that, you know, for instance, a region like ours has experienced from the confluence in the 18th and 19th centuries of the Ottoman, Russian, Prussian, Austro-Hungarian empires to then the Soviet Empire to neo-imperialism, or whether it's the United States or it's you hear so many people in Romania, like people in the street talking about German colonialism right nowadays, and the European Union and what kind of colonialism it is exercising in Romania. Like that's the perception, right, of the of some people. So without seeing this interpenetration of forms of domination, I think that we cannot possibly get to the bottom of what colonialism is, and it's definitely not just based on racializing people, although that's often a mechanism that is being built into othering the subjugated populations. I mean, Ireland is a good example. White people colonized by Britain, and it doesn't mean that they haven't been racialized, right? That they were presented in the 19th century as not being white in the same way as Western Europeans, or as the British. And as for like examples, yes, I'm so sorry that I didn't get to talk more about the literary examples, but let me like two examples. First of all, like one novel that has really fascinated me is Aike Armand's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, which is taught as a classic of post-colonial literature, published in 1968, very, very important, novel from Ghana. It has been interpreted for decades as a representation of the long arm of colonialism, how even after the independence of Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, we see how British colonialism is still embedded in Ghanaian society, and that's totally true. But that's not the whole story, because there are lots of references to socialism in the book. So how do we interpret that, right? Without understanding that under Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana was trying to build socialism, and without seeing this within the Cold War context, we cannot actually understand that novel fully. So for me, that's how the Cold War context is visible there. My other example is going to be from Kenya, and a person that I respect enormously, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is both one of the most important writers from the African continent, and also such an important cultural theorist whose book Decolonizing the Mind is and should justly be so one of the most important texts of post-colonial studies, even if in the establishment of the field in the 1990s it was marginalized and not perceived as such. So to me, the Ngugi's example is really enlightening, because his style of writing changed as a response to the cultural battles of the Cold War. So he was trained like all people going through a British system of education to believe that British modernism was the height of literary achievement, and he actually wrote a thesis on Joseph Conrad when he was a student. So one of his first novels, A Grain of Wheat, was written in a modernist style. We see, that kind of conflicted interior, conflict, turmoil, characters who, are wrestling with the past and secrets and things like that, and also the kind of indeterminacy in terms of who's right, who's wrong, in the battle between the characters in the novel. So this came out in the 1960s, and then in 1986 he revised the novel and streamlined it so it would be much more obvious that the anti-colonial fighters in Kenya were right. To also insert a bit of a leftist message in the struggle, and that also reflected his general shift away from a modernist Western style of writing to his interest in Soviet writing. And when he wrote, for instance, in 1979, the novel Petals of Blood, which is a big historical novel, the kind of like, Russian historical novels. And he says, he was in debt to Sholokov and to Maxim Gorky. So he was shifting his writing style because he thought that the Soviet writers were providing a different aesthetic strategy that would be more appropriate for representing the history of colonialism. And then he changes again his writing style in the 1980s, and turns towards earlier Kenyan cultural models, especially like oral narratives, stories, community stories, and embeds orality in his writing. So these are all transformations that, for me, speak of the kind of dilemmas that writers were facing during the Cold War in terms of how do I write, right? The what. So in the book, I talked about aesthetic world system. So starting from world system theory, which says that capitalism is the only world system, and that the culture that it produces is that associated with capitalism. I argue that during the Cold War, actually there were two systems, right? There was also a Soviet world system with its aesthetic world system that came with it. And what we see is that the kind of like friction between these two world systems and writers from the global south trying to position themselves in some way or another in relation to that.
That's, thank you, not just for the answer, but thank you, Sabina, for the question, because that was something that I'm very interested in. You, Monica, you were talking today, and you were talking in an interview that you gave regarding this book of yours, this recent book of yours, interview you gave to Victoria Lupashku. You were talking about how you came to be interested in this relationship, in this connection, in this historical junction between these two types of colonialism. But I'm also fascinated by the fact that while you were quite explicit that postcolonialism and postcolonial studies is helpful in terms of understanding Eastern Europe under the Soviet Union, the Cold War situation of Eastern Europe especially, because they provide, postcolonial studies provide a theoretical framework and obviously a critical vocabulary to question and rediscuss the status of Eastern Europe, the Second World in general. But I think that it's equally, to my mind, important to think about the possibility of using Cold War studies, of using studies connected to Eastern Europe as an explanatory narrative and a critical toolkit to question, as Sabina was suggesting, the traditional understanding of colonialism, the traditional understanding of post-coloniality in the Third World. And how do such studies and how does the East European perspective change the field of postcolonial studies, change the understanding of postcoloniality? You yourself are using the term multi-directional, yeah, colonialism, multi-directionality of colonialism, if I'm not mistaken, right, Monica? And which is a term that another Monica Albrecht uses in a book on postcolonialism, Cross-Examined, as she calls it. And you also use interesting terms like, for instance, the translatability of oppressive experiences in your article on Nicosia and Warsaw. So obviously, East European scholars or scholars of Eastern Europe are producing a critical vocabulary and also are producing an explanatory historical narrative of colonialism in the 20th century, of post-colonialism, decolonization, et cetera, that must force a new understanding of coloniality. So yeah, how do you see that? And how helpful is this kind of study, this perspective to your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so many of the people on the screen today have written on this topic and have had yourself included such fantastic insights in how Eastern European studies and post-colonial studies can help us understand post-colonial studies. And I think that this is, you know, a really important thing that we, as you know, the part of this region and part of this discipline must hammer out, continue to, you know, work at reshaping post-colonial studies with the much more nuanced understanding of what colonialism is, because of these overlapping forms of imperialism. And I want, you know, to also come back to something that someone said earlier. I think it was Professor Mihaila who mentioned it. You know, the presence of Russia and China in Africa today. I mean, we cannot possibly understand that presence if we just hold on to the classical understanding of colonialism. So we have to see how the past alliances that sometimes were supportive alliances between Russia and China or the Soviet Union and various African countries have been transformed into exploitative relations. And we can understand that if we look at what Russia and China have been doing as imperial powers, right? Whether in Eastern Europe or, you know, in Asia. So that will let us, and internally, right? There are forms of internal colonialism that we have to acknowledge as well. The very formation of the Soviet Union has so much to do with internal colonialism. So. This writer, South African writer with whom I've worked a lot, whose work I've worked a lot, Alex Laguma, he wrote a book called The Soviet Journey, and for him, this was written in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So he was invited by the Soviet Union and transported across the Soviet Union to all kinds of situations that were micromanaged for his benefit, so that he would see only the positive aspects of the Soviet Union and write something positive as expected, right? And he saw he saw that experience as being very important to think about how South African populations, which were experiencing internal colonialism, right? So the white minority dominating the Black majority and the colored population in South Africa, to see how that can be turned around. he thought, in the same way as in the Soviet Union, where everyone kind of like bands together, and also an agrarian society would be turned around into a developed industrialized nation. Preferably burning stages, like jumping from feudalism straight to to socialism, if possible. So he thought that was how the Soviet Union could influence our understanding of the South African situation. But of course, the opposite is, we can also see it from our perspective. If we think about internal colonialism in South Africa, we can definitely understand it better if we look at the case of the Soviet Union and the forms of internal colonialism that it had produced. Right? So that can nuance our understanding of colonialism by looking at Eastern Europe. Plus, the even more complicated situation once we look at the larger Eastern European picture.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And yeah, I'm thinking about how in conjunction.
I lost
okay,
you.
you're back. Okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking that I'm particularly thinking about how in conjunction Cold War studies and post-colonial studies will necessarily lead us to the conclusion that in fact we're not dealing with monolithic camps. Yeah. Whether you're talking about the Cold War studies narrative or the post-colonial studies narratives, the camps are not culturally homogeneous. They're not monolithic, right?
Exactly.
And to my mind, there are obviously the rival centers of domination, the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and the Western bloc, but they also have an informal but very, very powerful relationship of domination with the rival colonial centers' periphery. In other words, if the third world, let's say, is the periphery for Western colonial metropolises, there is an alternative periphery there to consider. That's Eastern Europe, right? Which willfully places itself under the cultural domination of the West, which it embraces, as Eva Thompson, the Polish scholar, was calling the surrogate hegemon, right? Yeah. The West, instead of the real hegemon, the Soviet Union, the Eastern Europeans embrace this surrogate hegemon. And so these are, the second and third world are somehow alternative peripheries to these power centers. And that poses also the question of, obviously, of political projects, because, you mentioned that, for instance, in the South African imaginary, Eastern Europe constituted both a model of dissidence, for instance, but also a threat. So you have this vacillation between, I don't know, for instance, the dissidents in Zaire looking at the future of the country in terms of the Baltic states model, calling for the the Baltic states of Zaire, Katanga, Kasai, and Kivu, right, in opposition to Mobutu. But also you have Yugoslavia, the Yugoslavian option proposed by Buthelezi, for instance, right? So you have these ideal models of possible political development in the post-colonial age for African countries. And obviously you have the danger of balkanization that is invoked in African political writing. So that's one thing to consider. And the other, obviously, is how you formulate your identities as part of this complex network of relationships between alternative centers and alternative peripheries. What does it mean to the usual understanding that you have self versus other, a simple bipolar opposition. Yeah, self versus other, the first world, the third world, yeah, in a simple relationship, when in fact, when you construct your identity, you have to consider the alternative center, yeah, the surrogate hegemon as well, as another alterity, cultural alterity, and you also consider the alternative periphery. Yeah, if you're an African, for instance, you consider Eastern Europe as well. So now you have three different alterities, cultural alterities, to which you have to relate in constructing your own identity. So it complicates the situation so much. And I think this is something you've been hinting at all along during your speech.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I've been trying to push for, you know, the thinking in these triangular models a lot, because it's impossible to think just in terms of binaries. That's very reductive, and it's whether, you know, those binaries are between the East and the West, or between the West and the global South. So we need to kind of think to find the methodologies and the models, the intellectual models, by mixing these toolkits that we have at our disposal, you know, the post-colonial and the post-communist studies offer us, in order to create a much more nuanced model, in order to understand identity formation, as you're saying. So definitely.
So we're confronted with a double jeopardy, with a double difficulty. One is the complexity that arises once you combine Cold War studies and post-colonial studies in these terms, in logical terms. And the other is obviously working with this iron curtain between the post-colonial critics and the Cold War critics that will not necessarily want to look across and over the this wall that separates them. So not very easy to deal with that. But anyway, if there are any other questions or comments from the audience. Yep, Joanna, please go ahead.
Just I want to ask Monica who she referred to as an artivist, because I want to remember the name of the person.
So his stage name is One Love the Quolor. He was born in Ploiești. Let me put his name in the chat.
Yes, please do. Yes.
Yeah.
Born in Ploiești.
Yeah.
Presented a paper on this at an MLA, I forget which one.
That's true. That's true. But now it has turned into an article that is coming out in a special issue that Ioana Luca is co-editing. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we should read that one actually. I might, I might take advantage of my friendship with both of you, both you and Ioana. Now this is very interesting. Yeah, that case is really interesting. I remember he's a kind of Manele singer or something like that, right? But the fact that he's
not. I mean, he's combining Ghanaian and Romanian various musical styles. But you know, like that album came out in 2011, I would say. And since that he's been producing so much, and all his albums have a color. So the one on the Romanian connection is called Brown Card, and he calls himself an African gypsy, both alluding to the ways in which he's being treated in Romania with disparagement and racism, but also kind of like assuming this kind of peripatetic figure of the traveling, wandering trickster figure, and but he has become really interested in various other forms of activism, which are reflected in his music, for instance, you know, in issues of gender equity, also in terms of musical production on the African continent and elsewhere in the peripheries and semi-peripheries of the world, right, including in Eastern Europe in relation to American culture. For instance, what it means for him to create original social criticism, but not to be recognized until it follows the patterns of, you know, the rappers in the United States of America. So what does it mean to actually be original and to produce original criticism? Also an eco-critical consciousness, the issue of pollution, especially on the African continent as a result of various forms of ecological exploitation by the West and other parts of the world, China included. So yeah, it's like really fabulous work that he's doing with his music.
Does he live in South Africa?
He lives in Ghana. He lives in Ghana.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yeah. So he's a product of the connections between the brief experiment with socialism in Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah and Romanian socialism. And Kwame Nkrumah actually died in Romania. The few people remember this, but he was so close to Ceausescu that he felt that the best place to come for treatment for cancer was actually in Romania, not in the not in the Soviet Union, so that he wouldn't be like a pawn, a medical pawn for the Soviet Union, but in Romania, and because of the cultural exchanges between Romania and Ghana, Emanuelo Bonsu, that's his real name. His father came to Romania as a student, and met his Romanian mother, and that's how that's his personal history.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
That there existed more than cultural, there existed economic connections with Ghana in the early years of the Ceausescu regime. Because I have a friend whose father and who herself had been in Ghana for some time because he was working as an engineer, and there was an exchange, and he went
exactly
there. Yeah, so this was in the early. I don't know, in the early 1970s or late 1960s.
Yeah, because it was so Ceausescu and Nkrumah overlapped for just a year while in power, because Nkrumah was ousted from power in '66. Yeah, so there wasn't much, and then Ghana kind of like turned towards a bit towards the West, not completely, but definitely more towards the West. But of course, there are connections with other African countries. And Romania was doing all this kind of like educational internationalism. I'm forgetting the name of the author who proposed this this term for what Romania was doing in terms of bringing in students, exporting experts in engineering, especially civil engineering, and
also mining engineering.
And sorry,
mining.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah.
But before Ceausescu also.
Yeah,
these were mutually advantageous contracts. And countries like Romania were also benefiting from the fact that African countries were paying in dollars, in hard currency, which was needed to repay the IMF and all these debts. foreign there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Romania was kind of like getting a little toe on the Western market through the connections with these African countries. So it's really, really interesting what was happening there. It's a topic that I hope to kind of like explore a bit more in the future, because there's so much that is there, but it hasn't really been explored yet. I mean, there's some work done by political scientists or some specialists in education as well, but not much.
Quite so. Well, if
Yeah.
there are no more questions or comments, I'm pausing because I'm not saying there aren't. I'm waiting for you to. Okay. Well, in that case, thank you so much, Monica.
There is a question. There is a question.
There is a question. Oh, yeah, that's right. Gabriel.
Hello,
Go ahead.
I got a question. I guess
Good.
I hope it's not an odd one. All right, so during the Cold War, Americans believed that the Soviets and the communist China have developed brainwashing techniques. Is there any possibility that that was in favor of the armies, more precisely in finding the military secrets, or was this technique used for something else? I mean, what was the reason for all these rumors? Were there other countries that encountered this, I could say, manipulation technique? Because I'm pretty curious.
Yeah. You know, when I teach Cold War literature, culture, I teach the film from the 1950s, The Manchurian Candidate, which is just like focused on this idea that that somehow the Chinese and the Russians could develop a technique for swaying the mind of people, for pretty much like embedding a different ideological consciousness into people's minds, and this kind of fascination and worry also translated into experiments that the Americans and the West were carrying out, and actually, unfortunately, McGill was a center of such experimentation. So they were using all kinds of substances to alter the consciousness of people and to see if they could be ideologically swayed as a result of that. It's like kind of like a horrifying part of McGill research history that has just recently come to the foreground. But yeah, they were, you know, sponsored by money provided by the Canadian and US government, exactly to kind of like counter the threat that such manipulation could happen by the Soviet Union or China.
Thank you,
Very
Gabriel, for your question. Sorry for not noticing the raised hand there. Okay, well, I think we should thank Monica for this wonderful presentation and such a great discussion after that. And I must tell you, Monica, that you're already part of the reading list for our students in some of our classes.
Oh, you
Yes.
are actually. I mean, that article,
Thank you.
the old one in the 90s certainly has been written.
Exactly, and we're hoping to make you part of our curriculum as well. Maybe we can work together towards a class that we might be teaching jointly. So
that would be wonderful, yeah. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor for me to, you know, to come to even by Zoom to Bucharest, and you know, to where I started, and to be in conversation with such distinguished people like yourselves, people who have shaped my own trajectory. So I'm really grateful for this.
well, now you're paying back. You're shaping ours. You're shaping the way we think about these subjects. So thank you. Anyway, thank you all for participating. It's been a great talk, and I think we can end here. Alexandra, thank you for doing the office.